Benjamin Siegel was born on February 28, 1906, in the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, the second of 5 children in a poor Ashkenazi Jewish family that had emigrated from the Galicia region of what was then Austria-Hungary. His parents, Jenny Richenthal and Max Siegel, worked long hours for low wages, and the household never escaped financial pressure. Williamsburg at the time was crowded, rough, and divided along ethnic lines, with Jewish, Italian, Irish, and Eastern European families packed into tenements. Street gangs were a constant presence, and for boys growing up there, violence was not abstract. It was part of the daily rhythm of the neighborhood. Siegel showed little interest in school and dropped out at an early age. He gravitated toward the streets of Brooklyn and Manhattan's Lower East Side, where informal gangs controlled blocks, markets, and sidewalks. As a teenager, he joined a gang operating around Lafayette Street, initially focusing on petty theft. That work escalated quickly. Siegel learned that intimidation paid better than stealing, and he began running protection rackets against pushcart vendors. Merchants who refused to pay found their carts vandalized or burned, a lesson delivered publicly so others would understand the cost of resistance. During these years, Siegel met Mo Sedway, who became one of his earliest criminal partners. Together, they refined the protection scheme into a steady income stream, demanding small but regular payments from vendors who could least afford to refuse. Siegel's temper became a defining trait. Multiple sources describe him as volatile, quick to violence, and fearless in confrontations. That reputation spread fast, and it kept people in line. By his late teens, Siegel had accumulated a criminal record that included armed robbery and violent assaults. Contemporary accounts and later law enforcement summaries also attribute more serious crimes to this period, including rape and homicide, though specific cases are often difficult to verify due to incomplete records and the nature of street-level crime at the time. What is clear is that Siegel was already known to police and rival gangs alike as someone who escalated situations rather than backed away from them. This early phase shaped everything that followed. Siegel learned how fear worked, how territory was controlled, and how money moved on the street. He also learned that loyalty mattered and that alliances were survival tools. Those lessons, learned in the alleys and markets of Brooklyn and the Lower East Side, set the foundation for the partnerships and power he would pursue next. In the early 1920s, Benjamin Siegel crossed paths with Meyer Lansky, another young Jewish gangster who had grown up in the same hard streets of Brooklyn. Where Siegel was impulsive and violent, Lansky was methodical and analytical. The partnership worked because each supplied what the other lacked. Lansky understood numbers, structure, and long-term strategy. Siegel enforced decisions with speed and brutality. Together, they built what became known as the Bugs and Meyer Mob, one of the most effective Jewish crime crews operating in New York. Their base of operations stretched from Brooklyn into Manhattan's Lower East Side and soon across New Jersey. Gambling operations came first. Dice games, card rooms, and betting parlors generated steady income, and Siegel made sure debts were collected without delay. Car theft followed, with stolen vehicles moved quickly through resale networks or stripped for parts. During Prohibition, the operation expanded again, this time into bootlegging. The gang hijacked liquor shipments belonging to rival outfits and redistributed alcohol throughout the city, often undercutting competitors and provoking violent retaliation. Violence was central to the mob's reputation. Lansky arranged contracts. Siegel carried them out or supervised the men who did. He was known among associates for acting without hesitation. Several members later recalled that when danger appeared, Siegel responded before anyone else had finished assessing the situation. That willingness to shoot first kept rivals off balance and earned the crew a reputation that traveled faster than they did. The Bugs and Meyer Mob also became a resource for larger criminal organizations. Italian and Irish gangs hired Lansky and Siegel to handle problems that required distance or deniability. Siegel functioned as a freelance enforcer, hired out to other crews for targeted killings. This role brought him into contact with rising figures in organized crime, including Charles Lucky Luciano, and members of what would later form the core of the National Syndicate. By his early 20s, Siegel was making serious money. He dressed sharply, lived well, and moved through New York nightlife with confidence. He purchased expensive apartments and homes that were far beyond the reach of most men his age. Drugs entered his life during this period as well, including opium, and he became involved in narcotics trafficking alongside his other rackets. The partnership with Lansky was cemented not only by profit but by trust formed under pressure. Each man had saved the other more than once during hijackings, shootouts, and retaliatory strikes. By the mid-1920s, the Bugs and Meyer Mob was no longer a street gang. It was an organized criminal enterprise plugged into a wider underworld that was beginning to reshape itself into something national, coordinated, and far more dangerous. By the late 1920s, Prohibition had transformed organized crime into a national business, and Benjamin Siegel was moving with it. The demand for illegal liquor created alliances that crossed ethnic lines, and Siegel and Meyer Lansky understood that the old neighborhood feuds were bad for profit. Bootlegging required coordination, territory agreements, and enforcement that did not spiral into endless street wars. Siegel's reputation for violence gave him leverage, but it was his willingness to work within a larger structure that elevated his position. In May 1929, Siegel and Lansky traveled to Atlantic City, New Jersey, to attend a meeting that would later be known as the Atlantic City Conference. The gathering was held at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel and organized by Charles Lucky Luciano and former Chicago gang leader Johnny Torrio. Crime figures from across the country attended, representing Italian, Jewish, and Irish organizations. The purpose was straightforward. Organized crime needed rules, coordination, and a way to make money without destroying itself from the inside. At the conference, Siegel openly supported the idea that Jewish and Italian gangs would no longer fight each other, a statement that reflected the changing priorities of the underworld. During this period, Siegel became more closely associated with Luciano, who was in the process of reshaping the mafia into a modern syndicate. Luciano believed power came from stability, not chaos, and he relied on men like Siegel to enforce decisions when diplomacy failed. As tensions escalated in New York between rival mafia factions, the conflict known as the Castel-Amorese War reached its peak. Bosses were targeted, alliances shifted, and the future leadership of organized crime in the city was at stake. On April 15, 1931, New York mob boss Joe Masseria was murdered in a Coney Island restaurant, an act that effectively ended his claim to power. Some accounts place Siegel among the gunmen involved, though historians have noted inconsistencies in witness statements and forensic evidence. Later that same year, Salvatore Maranzano, Masseria's rival and the last major obstacle to Luciano's control, was killed in his Manhattan office. Again, sources differ on Siegel's direct role, with some identifying him as one of the assassins and others treating his involvement as unproven. What is not disputed is that these killings cleared the way for Luciano's reorganization of the mafia. In the aftermath, Luciano and Lansky helped form the National Crime Syndicate, a cooperative structure designed to coordinate criminal enterprises across the country. Siegel emerged from this period not as a boss, but as a trusted enforcer and operator within the new order. He had proven that he could be relied on during moments when power was decided by gunfire. Prohibition was still in effect, money was flowing, and Siegel had positioned himself inside a system that rewarded loyalty, efficiency, and fear. In the early 1930s, the reorganization of American organized crime created a need for something more disciplined than street gangs and freelance gunmen. That need became Murder, Incorporated, an enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate, designed to carry out executions with efficiency and distance. Benjamin Siegel was among its founders. He helped shape it before control eventually shifted to Louis Lepke Buchalter and Albert Anastasia, though Siegel continued to work as an active enforcer long after stepping back from leadership. Murder, Incorporated operated as a centralized killing apparatus. Orders flowed downward from Syndicate leadership, and murders were carried out by specialists who often had no personal connection to the victim. Siegel fit naturally into this system. He was already known for his willingness to act quickly and decisively, and his prior work as a contract killer made him valuable. He carried out hits himself and supervised others, moving across state lines when needed. These operations extended throughout New York, New Jersey, and beyond. This period also brought internal conflict. Siegel and Lansky had previously provided information to the Internal Revenue Service that contributed to the imprisonment of gangster Waxy Gordon for tax evasion in 1933. In response, Gordon hired the Fabrizzo brothers to retaliate. The conflict escalated when the Fabrizzos attempted to assassinate Siegel and Lansky by planting a bomb inside Siegel's suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. The attack failed, but it marked a turning point. Siegel responded personally. After the deaths of two of the Fabrizzo brothers, the surviving brother, Tony Fabrizzo, began writing a memoir that included details about a nationwide murder-for-hire organization led by Siegel. When the Syndicate learned of this, Siegel took action. In 1932, after briefly checking into a hospital to create an alibi, he slipped out, approached Tony Fabrizzo's home with accomplices, posed as detectives, and gunned him down once he stepped outside. The message was clear. Silence was enforced and betrayal carried consequences. Despite his extensive involvement in violence, Siegel managed to avoid serious prison time. His only conviction during this era came in Miami on February 28, 1932, when he was arrested for gambling and vagrancy and paid a $100 fine. Law enforcement agencies were watching him closely, but cases collapsed, witnesses disappeared, or evidence failed to hold. At the same time, Siegel's associations deepened. He worked alongside figures such as Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, and Frank Costello, men who would shape organized crime for decades. His reputation was no longer confined to New York's Jewish underworld. He was known across the Syndicate as someone who could be relied upon when a problem needed to be removed permanently. By the mid-1930s, however, that reputation had a cost. Police attention increased, enemies multiplied, and contracts began circulating with Siegel's name on them. The same violence that had elevated him was now making him a liability. Within the Syndicate, conversations began shifting toward preservation. Siegel had proven his value, but keeping him alive in New York was becoming increasingly difficult. On January 28, 1929, Benjamin Siegel married Esther Krakauer, his childhood sweetheart from Brooklyn. The marriage appeared, at least on the surface, to mark a turn towards stability. The couple had two daughters, Millicent and Barbara, and for a time Siegel maintained a family life that existed alongside his expanding criminal career. He provided financially and ensured his family lived comfortably, far removed from the poverty of his own upbringing. That domestic structure never restrained him. Siegel's reputation as a womanizer was well established even before the wedding, and it continued throughout the marriage. He carried on relationships with multiple women, including Ketty Gallion, Wendy Barry, Marie McDonald, and later, Virginia Hill. These affairs were not discreet. They played out in nightclubs, hotels, and social circles where Siegel's name already carried weight, and they contributed to constant tension at home. His behavior mirrored the instability that marked his professional life during this period. Siegel's temper remained unpredictable. Associates described sudden rages that could be triggered by minor slights or perceived disrespect. This volatility extended into his criminal dealings. While he remained effective as an enforcer, his lack of restraint began to concern both allies and superiors. Violence that once served strategic purposes increasingly felt personal. At home, the strain was visible. Siegel's absences grew longer, and his priorities were clear. The marriage deteriorated as his affairs became more public and his lifestyle more erratic. By the mid-1930s, the separation between his family life and his criminal identity had collapsed. Esther Krakauer was left managing the children while Siegel moved freely through a world of nightclubs, mistresses, and syndicate business. This period revealed a pattern that would follow him for the rest of his life. Siegel could build alliances and generate loyalty in moments of crisis, but he struggled to sustain stability over time. The same impulsiveness that made him feared also made him unreliable. As his criminal profile rose, so did the personal chaos around him, eroding trust in places where discipline and discretion were becoming increasingly valuable. By 1936, Benjamin Siegel had become too visible in New York. Years of contract killings, retaliatory violence, and internal mob disputes had left him exposed. Law enforcement scrutiny was tightening. And more dangerous still, rivals inside the underworld were quietly discussing whether he had become expendable. The solution came from within the Syndicate. Siegel was sent west, not as a punishment, but as a pressure release. California offered distance, opportunity, and the chance to expand operations beyond the reach of New York prosecutors. Siegel arrived in Los Angeles with Syndicate backing and a clear mandate. He was to develop gambling and related rackets under the authority of the national organization, working in coordination with local crime boss Jack Dragna. From the outset, the balance of power was uneven. Siegel carried the reputation of a feared enforcer and had the support of Meyer Lansky and Charles Luciano, who made it clear that cooperation was expected. Dragna accepted a subordinate role and Siegel began consolidating control. One of his first moves was recruiting Mickey Cohen as his chief lieutenant. Cohen handled day-to-day enforcement while Siegel focused on expansion. Together, they absorbed existing gambling operations and established new ones, including bookmaking dens and illegal casinos. Siegel also took over Los Angeles' numbers racket and began integrating it into Syndicate accounting. On paper, he claimed income from legal gambling at Santa Anita Park. In reality, the money came from far broader sources. The most lucrative operation was the race wire service. Siegel helped establish and expand wire circuits that transmitted horse racing results across the country, allowing bookmakers to settle bets instantly. He coordinated with the Chicago outfit and other Syndicate partners to ensure uninterrupted flow. By 1942, the wire operation alone was generating an estimated $500,000 a day. That kind of revenue demanded secrecy, discipline, and absolute control, and Siegel enforced all three. Alongside gambling, Siegel expanded narcotics trafficking routes from Mexico into Southern California. He also oversaw a large prostitution ring and controlled offshore gambling ships that operated beyond territorial waters. These floating casinos allowed him to sidestep local enforcement while catering to wealthy clientele. Politicians, attorneys, accountants, and businessmen served as fronts, laundering money and insulating the operations from direct exposure. Despite the success, tensions followed him west. Siegel increasingly refused to report full earnings to Syndicate leadership, insisting he would repay loans on his own schedule. His handling of the wire services became a point of conflict, particularly when the Chicago outfit later intervened and reassigned control. Each dispute reinforced the same concern voiced years earlier in New York. Siegel could build an empire quickly, but he resisted oversight. By the early 1940s, Siegel controlled one of the most profitable criminal networks on the West Coast. He lived openly, spent lavishly, and moved easily between criminal meetings and legitimate society. The relocation had solved one problem but created another. Distance had protected him from immediate danger, but success had made him more independent than the Syndicate preferred. By the late 1930s, Benjamin Siegel had done something few gangsters managed. He crossed into Hollywood without being treated as an outsider. Los Angeles was still a company town, controlled by studios, agents, and quiet power brokers. But Siegel understood leverage. He did not force his way in. He embedded himself. Movie stars, producers, and executives welcomed him into their homes and parties, drawn by his confidence, money, and reputation. In a city built on image, Siegel fit naturally. He formed close friendships with actors such as George Raft, Clark Gable, Gary Cooper, and Cary Grant. Studio heads Louis B. Mayer and Jack Warner knew him by name. Actress Jean Harlow became a friend and later the godmother to Siegel's daughter Millicent. Younger performers including Tony Curtis, Phil Silvers, and Frank Sinatra admired him. Siegel hosted lavish gatherings at his Beverly Hills home, spending freely and cultivating loyalty through access and protection. To many in Hollywood, he was not a criminal. He was a powerful friend. Behind the scenes, Siegel was running rackets designed specifically for the entertainment industry. He used Syndicate influence to take control of labor unions and engineered strikes that shut down production. Once studios felt the pressure, Siegel offered solutions for a price. Payments were made quietly, work resumed, and his influence grew. He also loaned large sums of money to actors and executives, knowing they would never demand repayment from a man with his reputation. During his first year in Hollywood, he received more than $400,000 in such loans. Siegel's personal life during this period was just as volatile. He maintained relationships with several prominent women, including socialite Countess Dorothy DeFrasso. Through her, he entered European high society. In 1938, Siegel traveled to Italy, where he met Benito Mussolini. He attempted to sell what he described as a new type of explosive called atomite, claiming it could detonate without sound or flash. Mussolini advanced $40,000 to fund development. The scheme failed. In 1939, Siegel attempted a demonstration of the explosive for Mussolini and senior Nazi officials, including Hermann Goering and Joseph Goebbels. The test did not work. Mussolini demanded his money back and the deal collapsed. Siegel reportedly took an instant dislike to the Nazi leadership and later claimed he offered to kill them, backing down only after pleading from the Countess. There is no evidence that any such plot progressed beyond talk. When Siegel returned to California, his Hollywood influence remained intact, but the episode reinforced a pattern. He pursued power aggressively, even outside the Syndicate's core interests, and he often overestimated his ability to control outcomes. In Los Angeles, he was living openly among celebrities while running criminal operations at scale. To the public, he looked untouchable. To his partners, he was becoming increasingly unpredictable. On November 22, 1939, Harry Big Greenberg was shot and killed outside his apartment in the Hollywood Hills. Greenberg was a longtime associate of the Syndicate, a bookmaker and small-time operator who had begun signaling that he might cooperate with law enforcement. That alone was enough to seal his fate. According to court records and later testimony, the order for Greenberg's murder came from Louis Lepke Buchalter, who viewed the threat of an informant as intolerable. Benjamin Siegel was named as one of the men responsible for carrying out the execution, alongside Whitey Krakoff, Frankie Carbo, and Albert Tannenbaum. Greenberg was gunned down at close range, and the killing immediately drew attention. Unlike many Syndicate murders, this one happened in a residential area with witnesses nearby. Law enforcement moved quickly, and within months, the case began to unravel. Albert Tannenbaum confessed to his role and agreed to testify, placing Siegel at the center of the crime. By September 1941, Siegel was on trial for murder in Los Angeles, facing the most serious legal threat of his career. The trial became a spectacle. Siegel was housed in jail under conditions that sparked outrage and fascination in equal measure. Reports surfaced that he refused prison food, received female visitors, and was granted frequent leave for dental appointments. Siegel publicly denied many of these claims, insisting they were exaggerated or fabricated, but the image had already taken hold. He was no longer operating in the shadows. He was a headline. Press coverage dug into his past and revived the nickname Bugsy, a name he despised. Reporters described his appearance, his demeanor on the stand, even the color of his eyes. When one journalist, Floribel Muir, wrote critically about him, Siegel allegedly threatened her with violence, a moment that further damaged his public standing. The courtroom atmosphere was tense, charged by the understanding that witnesses were testifying against a man with a long memory and powerful friends. That fear proved justified. During the trial, 2 state witnesses died under suspicious circumstances. No additional witnesses were willing to step forward. Tannenbaum's testimony was discredited, and without corroboration, the prosecution's case collapsed. In 1942, Siegel was acquitted due to lack of evidence. Legally, he walked free. Inside the Syndicate, the verdict told a different story. The trial exposed vulnerabilities that could not be ignored. Siegel had drawn attention, embarrassed leadership, and created instability at a time when discretion mattered more than force. His ability to beat the case impressed some, but others saw the cost. He had survived, but trust had eroded. From that point forward, Siegel was no longer viewed simply as an asset. He was a risk, one whose independence and volatility were becoming harder to defend. By 1942, Benjamin Siegel was still earning enormous sums for the Syndicate, but his standing within it had changed. The acquittal in the Greenberg murder trial did not restore confidence. It reinforced doubts. Senior figures believed Siegel had grown reckless, too public, too independent. The war years brought increased federal attention to organized crime, and discipline mattered more than ever. Siegel, meanwhile, was moving in the opposite direction. The most serious point of friction involved money. In California, Siegel controlled gambling operations, wire services, offshore casinos, narcotics routes, and prostitution rings that generated steady income. Yet he increasingly refused to provide full accounting to Syndicate leadership. When questioned, he insisted that profits would be delivered in his own time. Loans extended to him remained unpaid. Requests for transparency were met with deflection or outright resistance. For men who valued order and predictability, this behavior was unacceptable. Tensions escalated around the race wire services. These operations were critical to Syndicate bookmaking, providing real-time horse racing results across the country. Siegel's handling of the wires drew complaints, particularly from the Chicago outfit. In 1946, citing operational problems and Siegel's behavior, the outfit took over the Continental Press and reassigned control of racing wire percentages to Jack Dragner. Siegel saw the move as a personal insult. To Syndicate leadership, it was a corrective measure. The gap between those perspectives widened. Siegel's personal conduct did nothing to ease concerns. He lived openly, spent extravagantly, and maintained high-profile relationships that invited scrutiny. Hollywood connections, once an asset, now looked like exposure. His volatility persisted. Associates described mood swings, sudden outbursts, and threats that seemed less calculated than before. Where Siegel once acted with purpose, he now appeared driven by ego and resentment. Despite these issues, Syndicate leaders remained cautious. Siegel had been valuable for years. He knew too much, and he still controlled profitable territory. For a time, patience prevailed. Discussions focused on containment rather than removal. Meyer Lansky, in particular, continued to advocate for him, arguing that Siegel could still be managed and that his ventures, especially in the West, held long-term promise. By 1945, however, confidence was wearing thin. Siegel's refusal to submit to oversight, combined with unresolved financial questions, placed him on unstable ground. The Syndicate was built on shared profit and enforced rules. Siegel was increasingly operating as if those rules no longer applied to him. The issue was no longer whether he could earn money, it was whether he could be trusted to remain part of the system that allowed him to do so. By 1945, Benjamin Siegel was looking for something that could reset his position inside the Syndicate. California had made him wealthy, but it had also made him defiant, and trust was thinning. Las Vegas offered a different promise. Gambling was legal in Nevada, land was cheap, and the city was still a rough railroad stop trying to decide what it wanted to become. For Siegel, it looked like a chance to move from underground rackets into something that appeared legitimate, while still serving Syndicate interests. The project that drew him in was the Flamingo Hotel. It had been conceived by William R. Wilkerson, a Los Angeles nightclub owner and the publisher of The Hollywood Reporter. Wilkerson envisioned a high-end resort on Highway 91, far removed from the frontier-style casinos that dominated Las Vegas at the time. Construction began, but Wilkerson was a compulsive gambler and chronically short of cash. As costs mounted, he turned to organized crime for financing. Meyer Lansky arranged for Syndicate money to cover the shortfall and sent Siegel to represent those interests on the ground. What began as oversight quickly became control. Siegel clashed with Wilkerson almost immediately. He believed the project was being mismanaged and that the vision lacked ambition. Using intimidation and the implied threat of violence, Siegel forced Wilkerson to sell his remaining stake. Wilkerson went into hiding, spending time in Paris to avoid retaliation. From that point forward, the Flamingo was no longer a private development. It was a syndicate casino, and Siegel was in charge. Once he assumed control, the scope of the project expanded dramatically. Siegel wanted elegance, not a desert gambling hall. He ordered redesigns, upgraded materials, and luxury features intended to attract wealthy gamblers from California. He insisted on the best liquor, top-tier entertainers, and a level of comfort that Las Vegas had not yet seen. He imagined the Flamingo as a destination, not a stopover. The ambition came at a price. The original budget of roughly $1 million ballooned quickly. By October 1946, costs had passed $4 million. By the following year, they exceeded $6 million. Contractors overcharged, materials were stolen and resold, and changes were made mid-construction. Siegel involved himself in every detail, often without understanding the consequences. He demanded speed while adding complexity, and the two goals collided constantly. To some associates, Siegel appeared energized, convinced he was building the future of Las Vegas. To others, he looked reckless. Syndicate leaders watched expenses climb and began asking questions about where the money was going. Siegel brushed off concerns, assuring them that profits would dwarf the investment once the doors opened. Behind those assurances was the same pattern that had followed him west. He believed vision justified excess, and he resisted anyone who tried to slow him down. By late 1946, the Flamingo stood nearly complete, a gleaming resort in the desert, funded almost entirely by syndicate money. Siegel had forced out the original developer, rewritten the project in his own image, and tied his fate to its success. For the first time, his name was attached not to a racket, but to a building. Inside the syndicate, expectations were now absolute. The Flamingo did not need to succeed eventually. It needed to succeed immediately. By the time the Flamingo prepared to open, the warning signs were everywhere. Construction costs had climbed past $6 million, a staggering sum for the mid-1940s and far beyond what syndicate leaders had approved. Materials had been reordered repeatedly, designs were altered midstream, and contractors charged inflated prices. Some supplies disappeared and later reappeared as new invoices. From the outside, it looked like incompetence. Inside the syndicate, it raised a more serious suspicion that money was being skimmed by Siegel, by his girlfriend Virginia Hill, or by both. Despite the concerns, Siegel pushed ahead. On December 26, 1946, the Flamingo opened its doors, even though the hotel was unfinished. The casino was operational, but many guest rooms were not. Construction noise echoed through the property, drop cloths hung in public areas, and promised amenities were missing. Locals attended the opening, along with a handful of celebrities including George Raft, June Haver, Vivian Blaine, Sonny Tufts, Brian Donlevy, and Charles Coburn. Siegel had envisioned a glamorous debut. What he got was chaos. The casino began losing money almost immediately. Within 2 weeks, gaming tables were more than $275,000 in the red. Siegel reacted badly. Witnesses reported verbal outbursts and confrontations with guests. At least one family was thrown out of the casino during opening night after Siegel learned how much money had been lost. By early February 1947, the Flamingo shut down. The failure was public, expensive, and humiliating. Inside the syndicate, patience was evaporating. Leaders had tolerated overruns before, but this was different. The Flamingo was supposed to legitimize their investment in Las Vegas, not embarrass them. Siegel insisted the problems were temporary and blamed unfinished construction and poor publicity. He convinced his backers to give him one more chance. He hired Hank Greenspun as a publicist and continued work on the hotel. On March 1, 1947, the Flamingo reopened. This time the hotel was functional and business slowly improved. Within weeks, the casino began turning a profit. On paper, Siegel had proven his argument. Given time, the Flamingo could succeed, but time was exactly what he no longer had. The brief profitability did not erase what came before. Syndicate leaders focused on the bigger picture. Millions had been spent without oversight. Financial records remained unclear. Trust had been strained beyond repair. To them, the issue was no longer the Flamingo's performance. It was Siegel himself. He had ignored warnings, resisted control, and gambled with syndicate money as if it were his own. By the spring of 1947, decisions were being discussed quietly, away from Las Vegas and far from Hollywood. The Flamingo was finally making money, but in the syndicate's view, Siegel had crossed a line. He had proven that success would not bring restraint. It would only reinforce his belief that rules did not apply to him. On the night of June 20th, 1947, Benjamin Siegel was sitting in the living room of a rented mansion at 810 North Linden Drive in Beverly Hills. The house belonged to his girlfriend, Virginia Hill. Siegel was relaxed, stretched out on a sofa, reading the evening edition of the Los Angeles Times. Around him were a small group of people, including his associate Alan Smiley, Hill's brother Chick Hill, Chick's girlfriend Jerry Mason, and the household cook, young S. Lee. It was quiet. Nothing about the moment suggested it would be his last. Shortly before 11 o'clock, gunfire shattered the calm. An unseen assailant fired through a living room window from outside the house, using a .30 caliber M1 carbine. The shooter stood roughly 14 feet away, partially concealed by shrubbery, with the weapon likely rested on a trellis near the driveway. 9 shots were fired. 4 struck Siegel. 1 tore through the bridge of his nose and destroyed his left eye. Another entered his right cheek and exited through the back of his neck. 2 more hit his chest. He died almost instantly. Smiley was grazed by a bullet, but survived. The violence was precise and deliberate. Beverly Hills police forensic specialist Clark Fogg later concluded that the shooting was most likely carried out by 2 gunmen, noting the improbability of a single shooter delivering such accurate facial shots without the target's head moving after the first impact. Despite this assessment, no one was ever arrested or charged. The murder was officially recorded as a homicide caused by gunshot wounds to the head, and it remains unsolved. News spread immediately. Reporters descended on the scene, including Floribel Muir, who had covered Siegel extensively and had spoken to him earlier that day. Photographs from the morgue ran on front pages across the country. One image showing Siegel's bare foot with a toe tag became emblematic of his end. Although he was killed in Beverly Hills, it was Las Vegas that felt the shock most acutely. Within hours of Siegel's death, syndicate representatives Mo Sedway, David Berman, and Gus Greenbaum walked into the Flamingo Hotel and took control of the operation. There was no confrontation, no resistance. The transition was immediate and final. Whatever debates had taken place behind closed doors were over. Siegel's role in Las Vegas ended the same night his life did. In the weeks and months that followed, theories circulated. Some believed the killing was a syndicate-approved hit, ordered after a meeting of crime bosses, and reluctantly accepted by Meyer Lansky. Others suggested personal motives, involving disputes over money, power, or relationships. Claims surfaced years later from various figures who said they were responsible or knew who was. None were proven. The truth, like so much surrounding Siegel's life, disappeared into rumor and silence. What did not disappear was the Flamingo. Under new management, it stabilized and became profitable. Its success encouraged further investment along the Strip. Other resorts followed, modeled on the same idea. Siegel had pushed too hard and too fast. Luxury replaced sawdust. Entertainment replaced novelty. Las Vegas entered the national imagination not as a desert outpost, but as a destination. Benjamin Siegel did not live to see that transformation fully realized. He was buried with a little ceremony, attended by few of the men who had once relied on him. Yet his impact endured. The city he helped shape moved forward without him, built on syndicate money, ambition, and the lessons learned from his excesses. In death, Siegel became inseparable from the birth of modern Las Vegas. A man removed the moment his vision began to work.